So good day, friends. This is Dr. Bob Hamilton, and you have tuned in today to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Thank you for being here. Thank you for making this part of your day. I know that all of you are living busy lives. You got kids, you got things to do, and the fact that you tune in to this show means a lot to me. And today we have a very special show. This is an individual you're going to meet in a moment who is very accomplished. She's done a lot of different things. She's a lawyer by her, historically a lawyer, but she has now moved on to the field of autism. She is the president of the National Council of Severe Autism. She's the past president of Autism Society in San Francisco. And her name is Jill Escher. Jill Escher, it's such a pleasure to welcome you to the Hamilton Review.
Thank you for having me, Doctor. I really appreciate it. And virtually visiting Los Angeles, the land of my youth.
The land of your youth. And by the way, San Jose is a good place to be too. I've been up there I have a brother who lives in that neighborhood, so I know where you're at. So we're going to talk about autism today, but I just want to say that Jill has written an article that is very poignant, and it talks about a lot of different, very important issues which are happening in the autism world today. But Jill, before we get to that, if you would be kind enough to let's back up the clock a little bit and tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what were the events that actually caused you to be doing what you're doing today?
Sure. Well, I am a mom who lives in San Jose, California. I have 3 children, and 2 of my children, a son who's 24 and a daughter who's 17, have nonverbal severe forms of autism. I moved up to the Bay Area to go to Stanford University, and then after a while, I hopped over the Bay and went to UC Berkeley to get a graduate degree and a law degree. I worked in the federal courts for some time. But then autism just kind of overtook my life, and I couldn't really manage having a real career anymore. And this is unfortunately a pretty common thing you see in autism families. You see one of the parents sacrificing a career to take care of their children. Pardon, my daughter's babysitter is here because I'm on the phone, so I needed to get a babysitter. So you'll see her in the background. I've really thrown myself very much into autism advocacy, support for families. I even am a housing provider for adults with autism. I provide low-income housing up here in the Bay Area for about 13 adults with autism and related developmental disabilities. I'm also a very, very active science philanthropist. I fund pilot projects looking at novel questions in the realm of causation, things that could be increasing the risk for autism. And I've published quite widely in the literature and speak at scientific conferences really around the world. And, all of these things, this kind of juggling plates. I do science, I do housing, I do advocacy, and I do community support. It's autism like 24/7. Oh, and then I have my kids. Let's not forget them. Yeah, so it's quite a lot. So when Barry Weiss and the Free Press approached me to write a piece about autism, of course I was thrilled because I felt this is an opportunity to publish on a fairly large platform.
Yep.
To really try to do a reality check on autism, because the media narrative, the public narrative, has gone so awry, is so skewed, that I think people are missing the dire realities out there. So I was so grateful that I had the opportunity to write this essay. It went very viral, which I'm very grateful for. I've gotten incredible feedback. So thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So one of the things that you talk about with having 2 children who have autism, first of all, is actually, I'm not sure people know this, but when you have one child who has autism, the chance of having a second child is actually pretty high. What is that number?
Yeah, it's about a 20% chance.
Yeah, so it's a big number. And now you have a third child as well. Is that an older child or a younger child?
Yeah, so my oldest son, he's 20, how old is he? 26. Wow. He lives in Texas now, and he stays out of things.
Yeah. So
He's out of
he's
it.
fine. He's doing well
Yeah,
in life.
he lives
Yeah.
independently. Good kid.
Yeah, that's great. So you talk about in this article, and this is a, by the way, how this is in the Free Press, is that correct? How do people
Yeah, the Free
find
Press.
this
Yeah.
article? Okay. Free Press is the publication. If you Google Jill Escher's name, Escher is spelled Echer.
Escheer, close.
I'm sorry, I wrote it down correctly. I said it wrong. Escheer,
Hmm.
Escher. If you Google that, you'll find the article. But you mentioned a couple things which I'd like to get into in some detail. You talk
Hmm.
about this idea of neurodiversity, and
Hmm.
this is becoming a kind of a word that you use frequently in the article and talked about it, and the idea that people who have autism are considered to be having neurodiverse um, entity. Can
Hmm.
you kind of go into this and tell us a little bit about what this really means and why this is beginning to really detract, I think, from the research of autism?
Sure. So neurodiversity has become a popular concept really over the last decade. We've seen it become incredibly ascendant. And, it has some positive aspects to it. What it basically means, and I think it has a lot of different meanings depending on who you're talking to, but basically it means that it sees autism and or other conditions, it could be ADHD, it could be mental illness, could be learning disabilities, etc., as part of the natural variation along the human continuum, and that it's not necessarily a disability, it's not necessarily a disorder, it's a natural variation, it's a different kind of human being, it's a different way of thinking, it's a different way of sensing the world and acting in the world. And so it kind of tries to demedicalize it, and tries to make it more of a social issue. A lot of neurodiversity proponents really use the paradigm of uh, homosexuality and kind of try to track that, like, oh, if you're gay, it's just a natural variation. It doesn't mean that you should be in the DSM, as having a mental disorder. They try to kind of model it on that kind of paradigm.
Yeah.
Now, there's some good things about neurodiversity, quite frankly. Like if you're a high functioning person with autism and you've been bullied, your whole life, and you've been called a loser, a geek, and you can't make friends, and you're feeling very isolated, and you don't really have an explanation for why you don't have the social wherewithal that everyone else in your class has, and why you feel like an outcast, and why you don't understand inferences and social cues, right? And then you hear, well, you're neurodiverse. That's why you don't have you're neurodiverse. Well, that's very empowering. And
Yeah.
I understand that. I can understand why somebody who's been marginalized would want to see their problem as a difference and as a tribe and as a culture rather than as a disorder. I get it, right? Now, the problem is that that's a lie. I mean, it's a useful lie, and I'm all for using the useful lie to the extent it is useful. But
Yeah.
it is a lie, because autism is by definition an impairment, and a substantial impairment in how people communicate, how they relate socially, how they behave.
Yep.
If I'm sitting here right now like this, instead of talking to you,
Yep.
that's not neurodiversity, that's a mental disorder.
Yep.
Okay. And there's so much trivializing of autism. There's so much sugarcoating, trying to recast it, right, as this kind of diversity. And it's just not. We can accept the fact that it can be a clinically valuable concept
Yep.
to use, but also completely accept on a medical level and on a scientific level that this is a mental disorder.
So it seems to me, and this is something concerning it. It seems to me that they're really trying to get away from words like disorder. I mean, the word disorder
Mm-hmm.
would be a word that would almost trigger some people in this world, and to use that word
Yeah.
too. And I think that there is a point where you kind of go, what is normal, what isn't normal. Now, I will tell you that my observation, and I do have a handful of children in my practice. I've been in practice for over 35 years now. So, Joel, I have had, my share of children who have autism.
Mhm.
They are not normal. They have definitely the way they interface, the way they act, the things that they do, sometimes violent things. These are
Mhm.
certainly not normal behavior. In fact, they're very abnormal.
Very.
They don't look at you, they don't interact with you. Oftentimes they're nonverbal, and sometimes they'll do violent things like hit you or throw things at
Mhm.
you. And
Mhm.
so, and these are things that you're totally, you are very aware of all this. But
Mhm.
why is that? What is this drive to really normalize things that are not normal? What is going on here?
Well, okay, I think it's a couple things. First, I think it is just the overbreadth of the word autism. You do have some people who are very quirky socially and, have some slight sensory and behavioral challenges, and they might be diagnosed with autism. They might be fully functional, independent adults. They might have college degrees. They might have successful careers, they might be married, they might have children, but they might be given the same diagnosis as my nonverbal children who can't read, who can't write, who can't talk, who can't play with toys, who lack almost any abstract thought.
Yeah,
So it's this absurd overbreadth of the autism definition. So the people at that very, very high end of autism who are super privileged, right? They want their autism, they kind of see their autism as all autism. They seem blinded to
yeah,
the vast heterogeneity and the vast, really, dysfunction in the large part of the autism community. So
yeah.
there's that, the overbreadth. Number two, I
We,
think,
by the way, Jill, just to
yeah.
interject real quick, we do talk about a spectrum. And we typically we recognize. I mean, certainly in my office, in my interaction with my colleagues, we do recognize that there is a vast spectrum of autism. Is that what you're talking about? You're talking about that spectrum is too big of to really maybe these people who are quote autistic are really should they have a different name?
Yeah, yes, that's what I'm referring to. And sometimes a lot of these people who are autistic are self-diagnosed. Some of the people who are most vocal, right, in the autism community have just, the slightest traces of autism, as far as I can tell. It's just not at all comparable. There's like no overlap in the Venn diagram with what my
Yeah,
children have. So it's really frustrating. Another reason is sort of this popular media narrative, that, the good doctor, or there was this book called Neurotribes by Steve Silberman that was published, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, that really popularized this idea of autism as, something quirky or, kind of a special gift, a superpower, that kind of thing. So people get fed this a lot, and they often don't see the realities of autism, like that you were talking about, these kids who really obviously have mental dysfunction, really
sure.
obviously are nowhere close to appropriate age level in terms of their abilities. So that's another reason. And then another reason, I think this is very important actually, is that people perceive, and in fact, scientists unfortunately perceive of autism as genetic. And sometimes it is. Now, but if you see a condition as genetic and nothing else, you might be inclined to accept the view that autism is just a type of, a different type of being, a different way of being human. You just have different genes, right?
Yeah,
It wasn't caused by like thalidomide, right? It wasn't caused by some like, toxicant from somewhere. If that's what you believe, you might see it as totally natural. So, for example, at UCLA, which is not far from where you are, there is a leading autism researcher named Dan Geschwind. He is probably the most famous autism researcher on the planet. He is both a geneticist and a neuroscientist, and he's done some incredible work. But Dan Geschwind believes that autism is entirely genetic. Let me be clear. Studies show over and over and over again that autism is about 10% to 14% genetic. And those are mostly de novo mutations, right, that occur in the child, not passed down through the
Right.
ancestry. But scientists have found that autism is highly heritable. Look at me. I'm a mom with 2 kids with idiopathic autism.
Yep.
Right? Idiopathic means cause unknown.
Positive.
It's obviously highly heritable. They can't find the genes, but it's heritable. So what has happened is the scientists will say, well, autism is highly heritable. We just haven't found the genes yet. And that has sort of morphed into this public narrative of autism as being caused by these genetic variations that we just haven't found. And in some families, those genetic variations just sort of blow up. I mean, I can't tell you, it's complete nonsense, but you have very elite people in the autism world telling this fable. So those are some of the reasons I think we've seen this narrative become very ascendant, and we've lost, I think, the incredible urgency that we used to have about this dramatic increase in autism. We've lost an interest in looking for the causes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I think that this is, autism was a rare event. I mean, when I was a child growing up, I will tell you that not that I had a big group of people that I was hanging around, but I don't remember anybody who had autism. I remember
No.
people who had other, they had maybe Down syndrome or other issues, but I don't remember autism as ever. I don't. Maybe I just didn't know. And now this is a remarkable number. 1 out of 36 is what they're saying now of 8-year-old kids, or 3% of 8-year-old kids now have autism, and
Right.
it has exploded. The numbers have exploded. I'm curious. You're in this world. Any ideas why they're? I mean, I have one thought I'll share with you in a second.
Mhm.
But what's going on, Jill?
Yeah, I definitely have ideas about it. I've been working on this for at least 10 years. I work in a field as a philanthropist. I'm not a scientist. I promote research. I fund pilot projects. I
Yeah.
write about it. I work in a field called non-genetic inheritance. I am a very big fan of the idea that heritability can be environmentally influenced. It's not necessarily handed down through the generations. So like I'll give you a very basic, simple example, even though this is not what I think is causing autism. But I'll give you an example. Let's say I'm a little girl and someone takes x-rays of my abdomen. Let's say I have an x-ray and then another x-ray, then another x-ray, then another x-ray of my abdomen. Let's say because I had some accident.
Yeah.
Well, something like that could induce mutations or other effects in my ovaries and therefore alter the way my eggs function. And therefore, if I have children, my children might be at a higher risk for having some form of disability, some form of, genetic or epigenetic disability.
Yep.
That's a very kind of obvious example, but that's what I work on. I work on things that can change a parent's sperm or egg, beginning really in the earliest days of gametogenesis when they are just fetuses, right?
Right.
You have your protosperm, you have your proto eggs, starting from when you're a fetus, and seeing the effects that has on their offspring. So I work on that. I work on some very specific exposures. I don't know if you want to get into that. It's a little bit,
You're
in
welcome
the
to briefly tell us, what are these exposures? What are you talking about? I
well,
mean, radiation obviously is one of them.
yeah, well, the exposure I've been working on lately, and it's not the only one of interest, is where a parent has had very significant or very unusual exposure to surgery under general anesthesia.
Wow.
So we've seen in animal models, every animal model that's been done to date,
Yeah.
Significant behavioral impairments in offspring of the parents that had undergone general anesthesia. So, of course, everyone undergoes that general anesthesia. We all need surgery, right? We all have our wisdom teeth out. We all have our, tonsils, whatever it is. We all do it. And so I'm not saying that this happens in every case. I definitely don't believe that. But I believe that there's a subset of cases where this very toxic exposure is influencing heredity and is specifically influencing the neurodevelopment of the offspring. So it's very complex. People can read my papers. They're all
Yeah.
online.
So
They can see my presentations.
you said the word, Jill, and the word is epigenetics. And
Yeah,
so
epigenetics.
basically, can you explain what epigenetics means? Because this is something that is sometimes difficult to explain to people. So go for it.
Sure. Yeah. Epigenetics, I think, is a term people should know by now, even though we didn't learn about it in biology.
Right.
So, we have every single one of our cells has DNA. Of course, DNA is coding for my brown eyes, it's coding for my brown hair, it's coding for my skin color, it's coding for my body shape. DNA does everything. But DNA is expressed through other mechanisms. So DNA just kind of sits there in your cell. It's like, hi, I'm a template. I'm here. I'm just sitting here. Other things control how DNA acts. What
Right.
genes get expressed? When do they get expressed? How much do they get expressed?
Yep.
So those factors, among other things, are called epigenetic factors. And it is how genes are transcribed that matters, I believe, in autism, not necessarily the nucleotide sequence of the genes. So that's really epigenetics is big and complex, and I can talk more about it, but that's basically what it means. So the instruction.
This is one of these things that you're right. We didn't learn about epigenetics when I was in medical school. Is something is becoming more obvious now that it isn't like you always have a gene mutation. It has to do with the histones and all the different things because the DNA is not lying naked in the cell. There it's covered by other, all these different proteins and what have you. And how they actually are called upon to express themselves in making proteins and everything. It's really, Jill, I guess as I get older in my profession, I stand back and I continue to be bloody amazed by how complicated the whole thing is.
It is. It really is.
It really is.
Yeah.
It's just like sometimes you kind of go, I don't know. I think we all kind of stand a little bit
But
mute.
it's a real problem. You have to understand it's a real problem in autism. Autism research is so hyper-focused on genetics that these people who get the big grants and all the attention, they just can't seem to break out of this genetics box and move to the next thing.
And partly, Jill, is because there are a couple of things like that you mentioned. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the male. What is it called? You mentioned your
gametogenesis,
no.
spermatogenesis,
The syndrome of boys who get it from their mothers. What is it called? Sorry.
X-linked, no, de novo.
No, you mentioned there's.
Like,
sorry. Okay. Anyway, but there. What?
Nothing. Go ahead.
There are syndromes which are related to genetics. I mean, there are kids who have autism and it's genetic related. Okay.
Yep. 10 to 14%.
Yeah, and it's a small percentage, and that is, I think, that's the leading reason why they keep on kind of falling back to this idea that it's all genetic, and they're desperately looking to find that gene. And of course, now we have the entire genome has been sequenced, so we can kind of look at it and go into it in greater detail than we've ever historically before.
Listen, there's been study after study after study on autism genetics using huge cohorts, using the most powerful tools in the world, and they basically can't find anything else. I mean, they're kind of done. I mean, it's time to move on.
Yep. Okay, so going back to this whole idea and why you wrote the article is you make a lot of comments about some of the national institutions and even an organization called INSAR, INSAR. What does that stand for, by the way?
International Society for Autism Research.
Okay. And it seems that they are beginning to spend more of their time doing language policing than really getting down to the details. I'm using your words here, but getting down to the details about what is going on here. So they're kind of just standing back and saying, where we can't figure it out. And also that goes kind of like in sync with that is this idea of preventing autism.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about this.
Well, there's been a lot. Okay, so in the professional societies, so INSAR is probably the largest professional societies for autism researchers and to an extent autism clinicians, although autism clinicians have mostly walked away from it.
Yeah.
But there's been the slow, steady devolution from these being very serious, very concerned organizations that were really looking to try to find the causes, trying to find prevention, trying to find treatments, towards this new paradigm, which is, gosh, how do we do better at accepting autism people? How do we bring more autistic researchers into my lab, right? How do we pass everything by a committee of people with autism to get their approval for everything that we do? How do we change our language so that we're not, quote unquote, stigmatizing, people with autism? There's so much more emphasis on that and rapidly decreasing emphasis. You don't even hear the word prevention at these conferences anymore. I mean, listen, in my mind, there's nothing more important in the world, right, than figuring out how to prevent autism, but you don't even hear it. You don't hear anything, you hardly hear anything about the massive increases in prevalence, not just in the US, but we see it in other countries as well. So these things that are the biggest, most important issues get ignored in favor of, what I think are kind of these trivial, kind of like social justice kind of issues.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they're kind of losing their way in a little bit. And one of the things that I found your article very, very compelling was this idea that, listen, the long term, the future is actually kind of grim a little bit.
It is.
Because there is no way that I don't know if people really understand the incredible investment that a parent makes when they have an autistic child and they choose to keep them in the house, because you're doing double duty, triple duty all the time. And it turns out you make the comment that autistic, parents of autistic children don't live forever. And I don't think any of us live forever. And so that point, when we have these long-term issues, like what are we going to do with people who have autism? And with the numbers soaring, I mean, when you're talking about 1 in 33, 36 individuals has autism, this is going to be a gigantic social issue. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, it really is. And this is something that's staring us in the face. Hi, Sophie. Staring us in the face, and we're kind of choosing not to see it. We're choosing to believe that it's always been here, but we somehow never noticed it. Like, you never met anybody with autism. I had never met anybody with autism, but I'm supposed to believe that 1 out of 24 boys had autism, and we just didn't see it. And like in New Jersey, there's like a school district there where oh gosh, it's 12%, I think, of all the boys were diagnosed with autism. And we're supposed to say, well, it's always been like that in New Jersey. We just didn't notice it. Here in California, we keep extraordinarily good data on developmental disability level autism. So the more kind of severe forms of autism, because you probably know about the regional centers. We've had a more robust system for finding cases and serving those cases than any other state. And this goes back to legislation that happened, decades ago. We have this data. The data shows us that there were about 3,000 cases of autism, like when I was in high school at Westlake School for Girls in Los Angeles, way back when. About 3,000 cases. Now there's more than 160,000 cases of autism.
Crazy.
It's not, and these are not mild cases. These are cases where you've had to overcome quite a hurdle to show that your kid was significantly impaired. 3,160,000 cases. I mean, it's not even close. And that represents a massive, massive threat to our social services infrastructure that we don't have. Believe me, all the agencies are feeling it. All the regional centers are feeling it. They get more and more and more clients, and they don't have more room. They don't have more staff. Everything's bursting at the seams, and we're not talking about the future. So I feel like, the more we just kind of romanticize autism or brush it off as something that's always been here, but under other labels, the more we do that, what a great disservice we're doing to our communities, to our families who desperately need a roadmap for the future.
Yeah, we're kicking the can down the road.
Yeah.
How many of the people out there who are homeless do you think are autistic?
That's a good question. Clearly, a lot of them have mental illness.
Yeah.
Might some of them have like a high, obviously they weren't like my kids, because my kids would die within a day if they were on the street. They wouldn't have any wherewithal. I mean, a
Yeah.
lot of these people who are homeless have incredible wherewithal, incredible skill at surviving.
Surviving.
And like people like my kids wouldn't last like half a day. They'd be hit by a car. Where they wouldn't know where to go for food. They couldn't talk. So, but some very high functioning people, possibly, people who just couldn't get a job. But they aren't there's lower rates, much lower rates of substance abuse, among people with autism. And that's not what we see. We see people with very high rates of substance
Yep.
abuse on the
Yep.
streets.
Absolutely. What about there's been this talk about transgenderism being higher in autistic.
It is. Yeah, it definitely is.
So tell us about that.
Well, it's been noticed in a couple of cohorts that people who identify as transgender or have suffering from gender dysphoria, that kind of an outsized number of them also are on the autism spectrum, usually a little bit higher functioning, because most of these people are verbal and
Sure.
cognitively
Yeah.
intact. And it's poorly understood why that is. As far as I know, there's no genetic link for it. You know me, I'm a fan of epigenetics. And so I think about whether there could be an effect on development that way. I think we also live in a world where there are high rates of exposures to what are called endocrine disruptors.
Yep.
Endocrine disrupting chemicals and endocrine disrupting pharmaceuticals. And that is, I think, underappreciated as a possible causal pathway in the increase of some of these disorders. That's speculation on my part. I've seen some animal models that kind of show how that works, but that's obviously not very poorly studied. So yeah, there is some overlap. We don't understand very much about it.
Yeah, and I don't think anyone thinks that there is. I mean, in terms of transgenderism, that there's a genetic component. Maybe there is, but it's just interesting that there is that relationship between people who are on the autistic spectrum and transgenderism.
Definitely.
One of the things that you come very strongly down on is this idea of vaccines causing autism.
Yeah.
And of course, one of our presidential contenders, Robert Kennedy Jr., is one of those individuals who has kind of pushed that narrative. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, sure. Gosh, vaccines, I'm just so surprised it remains such a hot button topic in autism, year after year after year. As a pediatrician, you probably see this all the time. The parents notice these things going wrong in their child at about the same time that they're receiving some of their early childhood vaccines.
Yep.
And so they've maybe heard that hypothesis floated, and so they make that mental link. And sometimes they just kind of stick with that. I think there are a few reasons why the vaccine myth continues. First of all, we don't have any other explanation for the increase in autism. As I said, I have 2 kids with autism, severe autism. There is not a single person in the world who can tell me why that happened. They have a more severe disability than almost anybody, right? With, Down syndrome or things with, clear chromosomal, contributions, and no one can tell me what happened. And so in this vacuum, people need to find some explanation. And, the vaccine hypothesis is out there. And so sometimes they grab it. I think, another reason is there's just a distrust of medicine, distrust of public
Yeah.
health. There's a kind of a conspiratorial kind of mindset. And I think that that is also playing a role. Well, they lied to me about this, therefore they must be lying to me about that.
Yeah.
It doesn't make,
No.
it's illogical. But there's no evidence for this link. I mean, they've done big epidemiological studies
Huge.
that show no link. There's also no real biological plausibility. If you look at mechanisms, Sophie, you want to say hi? Come here. I have a special guest. Everybody, Sophie Rose Escher.
Sophie, hello,
There's
Sophie.
Sophie. She's
Good
saying like, I want
afternoon.
my iPhone.
Hello, dear.
Okay, thank you, Henry. So, back to vaccines. There's no biologically plausible link between like
No,
a kid getting a vaccine and the rewiring of their brain.
that's right.
Because
No,
autism. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, I was going to say that like we have been battling this since Wakefield put out that article many, many years ago
Right.
now. And I can tell you that I have spent hours and hours and hours of my life trying to talk people off the cliff, off the edge there, and encouraging them to get the vaccines. Now, I will tell you that we have not been helped with the COVID situation because there was such a demand of the government to get everybody vaccinated, and the vaccines were initially thought that they were going to cure or at least minimize COVID, and everyone still got COVID. A lot of people
Yep.
did. Now, whether that was
Happened to me.
pardon?
Yeah, that happened to me.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I had the shots and I got COVID twice. But
Mm.
anyway, whether that attenuated the actual intensity of the COVID that I got was probably true. It probably did make a difference. But all that to say is that that did not help the overall situation. So there's been kind of a revival of this concept that all vaccines are now considered to be suspect, and I do hours, like I say, hours of my career have been spent trying to explain to people that this is not true science. And the huge studies, I did gigantic studies in Europe, that showed no evidence that there was any kind of linkage between the MMR shot in particular and COVID. But we still deal with that on a day-by-day basis. And I think you're probably right. It's the fact that we don't have a good explanation why COVID happened. So people want answers.
Why autism happens. Yeah, yeah.
They really do. Let me ask you a couple other things. First of all, what is the future? What are you looking at in the future, and what are your hunches in terms of how is there a solution here, or is there no solution? Should we continue to look for a solution? And what do you visualize tomorrow to look like?
Yeah. Well, I think a couple things. First of all, we need to have a very clear-eyed view about what's going on. We have to stop looking at autism through these insanely rose-colored glasses. We have to be realistic about the sometimes just horrific disability in many of these children. Even the friends I have with high-functioning autism are very impaired. And I think we can love them and we can accept them and we can support them without trivializing their disability.
Yeah.
So first of all, we just have to do that. Second of all, we need to have the scientific field needs to get off its butt. I'm sorry, they have failed us. I hate to say this because I've been a long-time supporter of autism research, but autism research, by and large, despite billions of dollars, has been a failure. We still understand very little about what's causing it. We have nothing to offer people in terms of prevention, right? And we have very little to offer in terms of treatment. I mean, the treatment toolbox today is about the same as it was 20 years ago, with a couple little kind of enhancements here and there. There have been no real breakthroughs.
But by the way, Lovas is one of those treatments. Have you any thoughts about Lovas quickly?
So you're talking about behavioral treatment,
Right.
applied behavioral and analysis treatment, ABA treatment. In a nutshell, I'm not a fan. I think that it's way overhyped. I think it has a place, but in terms of something that will change the trajectory of your child's development, from being autistic to maybe not being autistic, or maybe, radically improving the outcome. I have yet to see any data supporting that. And really what I see in the community is like very few anecdotal, very little anecdotal evidence to support it. It does have a place, and I don't dismiss it entirely, but it's overhyped, and I think it's a false hope given to a lot of people.
No, I see a lot of people do this. The people in my practice have done it, and what can I say? I have not seen a radical change in most of them, but people sometimes it is anecdotal. It really is very anecdotal.
Yeah, it is. It is. So yeah. So we need to know causes. We need prevention. We need treatment. I mean, listen, we're entering a new world where increasing proportions of our population is seriously disabled. We've never faced anything like this before, and this is not sustainable.
Yeah,
it's just not.
Well, I completely agree, and I'm not sure what that is a little bit worrisome to me, because I think in 15, 20, 30 years, when these young people are hitting adulthood, that's going to be a problem. You do mention one thing, and this is something too. Jobs. I mean, a lot of young people can get jobs. I mean, kids who have autism, mild, moderate autism, can get a job. Maybe not necessarily. There may be menial jobs. You take issue with the idea that the minimum wage has now been elevated to such an extent that people can't hire people for lower than minimum wage. Your thoughts about that quickly?
Well, there's been a strong movement to basically defund and prohibit job programs for people with disabilities when those job programs pay less than minimum wage. That's one issue. There are many issues, but that's one issue. Here in California, because we're such geniuses, because our legislature are so brilliant, we scrapped our sub-minimum wage program for adults with developmental disabilities. Well, that's fine for those high-functioning people that can get a job at Safeway. You can get a minimum wage job somewhere, who have the wherewithal to compete in a competitive employment environment. But the vast majority of these clients don't have those skills. And we are just throwing away these programs. Why? Because it's so compassionate, because we don't want to pay them less than minimum wage. Well, guess what? These aren't really jobs. I mean, they're not jobs they're relying on. These people get Social Security, they get benefits, they get regional center benefits. These are services for these people. And we're getting rid of services and not replacing it with anything. And this is what's happened to disability rights. Disability rights has become this ideological crusade instead of looking realistically at people with disabilities and what they really need.
Well, listen, Jill Escher, I love your passion. I love what you're saying. You're absolutely right in so many of these areas. And I think that we do need to really rethink autism is coming at us, is going to come at us, I think, in the future in a very, very big way, because these numbers are very, 1 out of 36 8-year-old kids have got autism. That's a big number. And when these kids grow up to become adults, we're going to have to deal with it. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your advocacy. Thank you for writing this article. Again, it's available on Free Press. And Jill's name is spelled Jill, Jill, Escher, Escher. Great article. The name of the article, again, was what, Jill?
Oh, gosh. They gave it the name. I think it was called The Autism Surge.
Okay, the autism. Okay,
the autism.
Yeah. I know the authors never know that the
right.
article. Okay, you'll find it there, friends. If you Google her name, Jill. How can people find you in general?
I have a website, jillescher.com. I'm also president of National Council on Severe Autism. That's ncsautism.org. And I am a big, huge, involved at Autism Society San Francisco Bay Area, sfautismsociety.org.
Beautiful. Okay, friends, so thank you for joining us today for the Hamilton Review. It's been a pleasure having a conversation with Jill Escher. She's an activist. She is out there doing it. And so appreciate your passion, Jill.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's been a pleasure. So friends, until next time, be well. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
You have been listening to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Thank you for allowing us to be a part of your day. Tune in again next week on Apple Podcast. Rate and comment and tell a friend.